When Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," he was only doing what all knowledge presupposes, and that is self-awareness. It is from this idea that I'm aware of my own states of thought, my own consciousness, and therefore my own self, that I then go, there's thinking, there's consciousness that's occurring that I'm aware of, and my direct awareness is myself. So when Nietzsche says we are unknown to ourselves at the very beginning of the genealogy of morals, we men of knowledge, he meant it to be paradoxical, because what he wants to argue is that this self-knowledge must be something that blinds us to ourselves because of the very nature of knowledge and the way it is attained. And so what we want to do in this segment is explain Nietzsche's arguments as to why this fundamental assumption in all Western thinking, that only I can truly know myself, and that I am best known to myself and myself alone, because no one else can be conscious of my conscious states. We're going to see how he argues that the very assumptions that undergird this are false, and that when we attend to what it is that we know and how we know it and how consciousness works, we must necessarily be the least knowledgeable about ourselves. Now you notice something here. He says we're strangers to ourselves, and we must to an eternity be most strange to ourselves. Therefore, he's not arguing that we can't be known, that I'm a black box. He's arguing that if I want to know about myself, I can't go to myself. I'm not my best witness. Indeed, I'm way too close. And you've all heard this before, that if you're too close to a situation, you're too involved, there's too much emotion going on, then you perhaps are the person who is least objective and therefore least able to understand all of the facts. And this will go into this. So how does he make his argument? He says, how can we know ourselves? Because we can only find what we seek, and we've never, and indeed can never, seek ourselves. Now, by doing this, what he is doing again is alluding to the biblical knowledge of his readers. This is a different error than our own. In this error, if I were to bring this seeking and finding, and our treasure is where our heart is, and things like our heart is where our treasure is, hardly anybody would get the reference that this is Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6. But every one of his readers were very good Protestants and Catholics and knew Jesus by heart. And so he's using these biblical references to drive home the nature of value itself and how it determines our knowledge. So now, what does this mean, seeking and finding? Well, if I'm going to know myself, I have to seek myself, don't I? The seeking is attending to, right? It's bringing into attention or focus your task at hand. If you don't attend to a task, if you don't consciously go with awareness to do it, then you'll never get it done, right? And this is true at learning. If you don't pay attention in class, then what will happen? You won't learn. It will go by, and your memory won't pick it up because you didn't attend to it. And therefore, what he's saying is knowledge requires the activity of attending to, of seeking. You cannot find what you don't seek, especially if you don't already have it. So therefore, all knowledge requires attention. This is his point. He uses the illustration of bees going about the task of collecting honey. And in that task, it's that one singularity of concentrating on that task that allow the bees to be successful. And he says in our very task of collecting knowledge, we therefore need to attend, to focus. And to focus is to narrow your attention, not to widen it. So I suppose I am trying to learn about myself. Therefore, I'm going to direct my consciousness to my consciousness. I'm going to attend to my conscious states. The problem is this. Focus narrows. And in narrowing, it has to ignore. Let me give you an example. Again, the example is something that Jesus already talked about in this sermon. He said, no man can serve two masters. He will either love one or hate the other. He will serve the one and not serve the other. And this is especially true when these two masters come in conflict. What are my masters? Those are the things I attend to. Now I want you to look at both of these pens. When they're close together, you can focus on them, can't you? But now what happens as they go apart? I want you to try to focus on both of them at the same time. Attend equally to both and try to see what's happening. Now, what happens to your attention? Eventually, you're going to have to what? You're going to have to choose. You cannot focus on these both at once. If you try, you will lose both of them. That's the nature of focus. Focus involves attention. Attention involves selectivity. You must select what you're going to attend to. And by selecting and focusing, you create a certain thing that is necessary for all knowledge. A foreground in relation to a background. What you focus on is there, and what is not focused on then surrounds and becomes the background that gives the subtle shape or characteristics to what you actually attend to. So thus, focus requires this foreground-background distinction. What is the foreground is what you are conscious of. What is the background is what you can't be conscious of, because if you were conscious of it, it wouldn't be background anymore, it would be in the foreground. And so therefore, when you're attending to yourself, there's this infinite amount of data, but you cannot attend to all of it at once because a lot of things are going on. For example, right now, as I'm talking to you, some of you might notice the air conditioning is going on, and you might hear that in the background. But if I didn't point it out to a lot of you would not have even recognized that that's what you were hearing, because your mind is focused on distinguishing my words and understanding my speech, not in monitoring the air conditioning in the background. This is what we do in a busy restaurant all the time. We're talking to someone, we feel as if we're alone, and we ignore the hubbub of background noise. But if we wanted to know what was going on in the next table, that is the couple that's seated right next to us who are arguing with each other, if all of a sudden that drew our attention, then there's no way we could focus on the person who's talking to us, and therefore we have to ignore it. And so therefore, the nature of knowledge requires selective attention, which requires this foreground and background, and therefore all knowledge depends on infinite ignorance. The minute I attend to myself, I cannot attend to the totality of my conscious states, but what? I am my conscious experience and states, and therefore I must ignore most of what is going on in my mind at that moment. And therefore I mistake the part for the whole. Now that needn't be such a bad thing if I got at what's essential, right? If I got at what's really important about my conscious states, I was able to direct my attention to that, then ignoring the accidental wouldn't be such a big deal. But here's the problem with consciousness. Consciousness is what I'm aware of and what I'm not aware of, as I said before. So think of the idea of that picture again, the picture you take with your camera. You're going to have the focus part, and then you're going to have the part that's ignored, that's blurry and in the background. Doesn't that frame your knowledge? Doesn't it frame your experience? So it gives your experience a certain shape by leaving certain things out and bringing certain things to the fore. Then what follows is the background is what determines the foreground, doesn't it? But you can't be aware of that. You can't be aware of it directly because it is background. And if you are aware of it as background, it wouldn't be background anymore. Therefore, what controls your actual conscious, focused, attended experience is that which you can never attend to. The very thing you must ignore actually is the part that's most important about your mental states at that point, why you're attending to what you're attending, why it appears the way it appears is precisely because of what is left out. Just like this. When I look at a window, the window is such that it directs me to look through the window, not at the window. Thus, what's most important about the window is what I don't look at, because the window frames what I see outside of it. And without that frame, I wouldn't see the same thing. But because the window is such that it's meant to be looked through, then in order for the window to function as a window, I must ignore that which frames my experience. And is that frame, that background, that which I must ignore, that actually determines it the most. So then the question is, not only is it that the nature of knowledge is such that I must ignore, and what I must ignore is most determinative for who I am. That's called the subconscious, the mental states which I can't be conscious of, but are still parts of my consciousness. But the way in which my attention is done is through where my treasure is. So Nietzsche brings this out. He says, where your treasure is, there's where your heart is. And what does that mean with respect to consciousness is that I only pay attention to what's important to me. Isn't that true? So why am I in a class like this? Now, because all of a sudden philosophy has become important to you. Why? I won't answer that question. Maybe you were always interested. Maybe it's because now this is necessary for you to get through your degree and therefore get your BSN. No matter the reason why it's important, the minute it becomes important, you become aware. Isn't that the case? Things stick out that are more important. In fact, this is such a commonplace in neuroscience that we have a term for it, RAS, the reticular activation system. You see this at hand when you buy a new car, right? Like, for example, when I first bought my new Toyota RAV4, what I recognized was that all of a sudden, on the road were all these RAV4s that I never noticed before. I was like, wow, why is it the case that when I buy a new car, everyone else buys the same thing? That's not the case. There's always been that many, and that has always been input into your brain. The problem is you never paid attention to it before because it didn't stick out to you. It wasn't important. The reticular activation system is that system which causes us to attend to the things that we find important. And that is what helps our survival. And so what you see is it's our values, our treasure, that determines our awareness. So let's say I'm learning math. I look at various shapes and colors, and I'm learning about trigonometry. So now what's important to me is triangles, right? So I notice triangles everywhere. I see a purple triangle. What I see now, I'm attending to, am I not? But I'm attending to only one aspect of that purple patch, its shape. And that's what becomes important to me. That's what draws my awareness. Well, when that becomes important, the object before my eyes has now been defined by what's important. And that's its triangularity. This is a triangle. It's not a purple patch. It's a triangle that is purple. And so therefore, I then mistake what sticks out for me, and therefore as its defining features, right? And I do use those important aspects, the triangularity, the shape, to define the object itself. Therefore, I mistake my values for what's essential in the object. I mistake that the thing that made me attend to this is actually something in the object and makes the object itself. Since shape is important to me, now this is a triangle and not a purple patch. And therefore, what's essential to it is its shape and not its color. But if I was thinking of purple and looking for purple things because I'm an interior decorator, then what would become important to me is the purpleness. And that would just be a purple patch. And its shape would be inessential. So I must ignore the values that set up the things that stick out to me And I must, if I'm going to learn anything, mistake the value for the essence. I must mistake the value that made me stick out for something I discover as essential to the object itself, when it really is just the important characteristics, the characteristics of that swarm of reality that I found important. But I cannot believe that, because if I believed it was just my values that determined what was important and therefore what was essential, I wouldn't have objective knowledge. And so therefore, I must ignore the treasure. I must not see it as the thing that determines the object. I must see it as something that's in the object, even though it is what creates the object itself. So what's the key point? The key point is the nature of my present investigation. The nature of consciousness, when it seeks to know, requires that I ignore most of everything that goes into why I'm conscious at that moment. Therefore, I cannot know myself, because the important parts of myself, the parts that cause me to be what I am, are the very things that must be ignored for me to even have self-awareness. Thus, self-awareness can never be self-knowledge.